So welcome to our Corvids 101 webinar. My name is Sarah and I'll be your presenter today. So you all are probably Zoom experts by now, but just in case, I want to point out a few things. The green circle on the left-hand side, lower left-hand side, we just want to make sure that you all are muted and have your videos off, and that just helps our technology to run a bit smoother. If you have any questions, and we hope that you do, that chat bubble in the middle, that middle green circle, you can click on that. And then make sure that your message is going to everyone. So that right-hand green circle, you can send private messages, but more than likely, if you have a question, someone else is going to have a similar question. So we want everyone to be in on the conversation. So just make sure that you're sending to everyone. And then a good way for you to be able to see my shared screen and also see the chat, if you exit full screen, and then click on that chat bubble, it should dock the chat window to the right-hand side of your screen.
Oh no.
Okay. So like I said, my name is Sarah Doxson. I'm an environmental educator with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And my favorite bird today is the black-billed magpie, which you can see on top there. And then our chat box moderator is Stacy Monahan. So she'll be doing her best to answer questions in the chat box, and you'll hear her voice pop on from time to time. And her favorite bird today is the Clark's nutcracker, and conveniently we'll get to learn about both of these birds today. So just a little bit about Bird Conservancy, if this is your first time joining in on a program with us. We are a nonprofit conservation organization, and our mission is to help conserve birds and their habitats, and we do that through a kind of multifaceted approach, which makes us a little bit unique in the conservation world. So we have three teams. Our science team, they are doing that boots on the ground research. They are out in the field counting birds, doing banding, monitoring populations, all of this really important work that informs us about how birds are doing. We also have our stewardship team. They are working with private landowners, so like farmers and ranchers, and they help to educate them and work with them to implement conservation practices on their land that not only is going to benefit the habitat and the birds and other wildlife that live there, but also their business as well. And then lastly, we have the education team, and that's us. So our job is to get people excited about birds, learn why and how we can help protect them. So that's why we're here today, to help us all get excited about the Corvid family. So now that you know us a little bit better, we want to get to know you. So if you can share in the chat box where you're watching from today, how many people are watching, and what is your favorite bird today, or the last really cool bird that you saw. And the reason we want to know this is because it just helps us to keep track of kind of our demographics and how many and who we get to talk to throughout the year. And also our funding is based off of our numbers. So we want to be able to count all of you and see how many people we have reached about birds. So I'll give you a minute to do that. Thank you so much. So while you're doing that, kind of go over our objectives for today. So the goal of this webinar, we're going to explore what makes corvids unique. We'll learn how to identify some common corvids, And when I say common, we are based in the Front Range of Colorado, and we have been so blown away that we have had people from other states, even other countries, join our webinars, which is absolutely incredible. But we are going to focus on more of the Front Range species. But hopefully, if you live outside of the Front Range of Colorado, what we learned today will give you a really good starting place to explore the birds that are common in your area. And then last but not least, the really, really cool part is discovering what insights studying corvids can give us to our own intelligence. And before we get down to that specific family, you might be wondering, why birds? Why are we a whole organization? And there are several more like us that are dedicated to just conserving birds. Well, birds are incredible creatures, and we can kind of break it down into four main things. So first of all, they're inspirational, right? From artwork, whether it's music or poetry or painting, to engineering, to inspiring human flight. Birds have inspired us for a really, really long time. They are accessible. So if you live in downtown Chicago, you can still see a bird, right? And they are really one of the only creatures that no matter where you are on Earth, you can see. They live on all 7 continents in a huge variety of habitats. So that is, especially in times like these when people may not be able to leave their houses, birds are a really great way to stay connected to nature. Birds also provide what we call ecosystem services. So these are things like pest control. So if you are outside in the summer, I know I don't particularly like getting bitten by mosquitoes. So a lot of birds eat mosquitoes though. Or raptors are eating, mice and rats and things like that. So that is an ecosystem service. Also things like seed dispersal, or fertilizing the land with their droppings, things like that. So if birds were taken out of the ecosystem, it would be a very different place and probably wouldn't fare too well. And then the last one I have here, birds serve as environmental indicators. So birds are fairly sensitive creatures, and they are often one of the first types of animals to show that something is wrong with the environment. So you might have heard, the canary in the coal mine. They would bring a canary down into the coal mines, and if that canary started showing signs of stress or respiratory problems, things like that, the canary was more sensitive to noxious gases that might be in the caves, so that the miners would stay safe. So that's what we mean by the canary in the coal mine. They're one of the first signals that something might be going wrong. If we notice that something is happening in birds, that lets us go in right away to start figuring out how we can fix whatever has happened before it has even bigger repercussions. So that's a little bit why birds are so important. You might be wondering, how many birds are there? So in the entire world, and like I said, they can be found on all 7 continents, which is pretty incredible. We can find about 10,000 species of birds. In North America, we have around 1,000 species. In Colorado alone, we have 507, give or take. And Bird Conservancy, our headquarters is at Bar Lake State Park in Brighton, Colorado. And it is what is known as a birding hotspot. And throughout the year, you can find around 350 species of birds, which is absolutely phenomenal. So if you want to learn more about birds, you should definitely visit Bar Lake. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. Okay, so we're gonna take a time machine and go back to high school biology. It might be a little bit further away for some of us than others, but you might remember a graphic similar to this. So when we're figuring out how we classify plants and animals and living things, we use this taxonomic rank. I actually learned King Philip came over for great spaghetti. This one says soup. The kids these days are learning kids prefer candy over fried green spinach. So that's a fun little mnemonic device to help us remember the order of this taxonomic rank. So for what we're talking about today, birds, all birds fall under the class Aves. The corvids fall under the order Passeriformes. So that's going to be basically our songbirds. So warblers, chickadees, finches, all the way up to ravens are the biggest songbird. The Passeriformes order is huge. It contains, I think, over half the bird species. And then going down to family, Corvidae. So that's where the name Corvids comes from, the family Corvidae. So that's going to be our crows, jays, magpies, nutcrackers, and ravens. So those are what we're going to learn about today. So when we are breaking birds into groups and classifying them, of course, when we're classifying things, we put like with like. So some common characteristics to look for if you're out birding and you see a bird, especially if you're a beginner birder and you're just not really sure where to start, you know, you're looking in your field guide and you're just overwhelmed by these, you know, all these pages. If you start to look for similarities, it will help you narrow it down to family. And once you get to family, of course, it's much, much easier then to figure out species. So for the corvids, what you're going to look for is they have this really strong, sturdy bill. They have pretty strong, thick legs. They're very loud. They're usually quite social. They're omnivores, so they'll eat just about anything. And almost all of them are residents or short distant migrants. So they're not going to migrate all the way down to Mexico, for example, most of them. All right, so let's dive right in. Actually, before we do dive in, have there been any questions yet, Stacy?
Oh, not yet.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay, here we go. And don't worry if you are a note taker, feel free to take notes, but we are recording this and we'll put it on our YouTube channel. So don't feel like you have to be stressed writing down everything I say. It'll be up on our YouTube channel by next week, so you can go back and watch it again and share it with your friends and family. Okay, here we go. So we'll start with our jays. And these two jays, you could classify them as our lower elevation jays. So the top one, of course, is our blue jay. It's a common backyard bird. Even if you don't have a bird feeder set up, you've probably seen one in your backyard, or at the very least heard one. So they can be a bit of a bully. So if you do have a bird feeder, you might have noticed that. And some consider, because of that, some consider it a nuisance bird, but they are just so beautiful. I mean, look at all those colors and patterns. It's really quite intricate. And the bridle, so that kind of black necklace that starts kind of on the side of their face and goes around their throat, called a bridle, that can actually be unique. It can be different in different blue jays, and that might help them to identify each other. So it's kind of like giraffes that have a certain pattern of spots, or zebras that have a certain pattern of stripes. And one kind of interesting fact about blue jays is that they love acorns. And they love acorns so much, and corvids have a habit of caching food, and we'll talk more about that later, but kind of hiding it for later. They are credited with helping to spread oak trees across the country after the last ice age. And then the one on the bottom is our Woodhouse's scrub jay. So this jay isn't quite as urban as our blue jay. They're found in more scrubby habitats, right, as its name kind of suggests. But they can be found in suburban areas. So we have been running a banding station down at Chatfield State Park in Littleton. So that is close to the foothills, a bit outside of town, and we were lucky enough to catch some of these scrub jays. A really big difference that you probably notice is the lack of crest. So the blue jay on top has that kind of blue mohawk looking thing, and scrub jays actually don't have that. And most jays don't actually, but that is a telltale sign of a blue jay. And if you are thinking, gee, I'm confused, I thought that was called a western scrub jay, you're not confused. Something that is really fun and exciting, but can also be frustrating about birding is that birds are recategorized quite frequently. So in 2016, it was decided that the Western scrub jay, that would be separated into two different species. So we have our Woodhouse's scrub jay, which we see here, and the other one is the California scrub jay, which of course is in California. And they are very similar, but if you take a look at them, you will notice the differences, and they do occupy a little bit different habitat as well. All right, and then, so those are lower elevation jays, the blue jay and the Woodhouse's scrub jay. And with that scrub jay, they're really, really cool. If you ever go out to, if you're out in the foothills, they have these, it's almost like white striping on their neck and this gray belly, and then a beautiful blue on their back and that white eyeline. Next are our higher elevation jays. So the top one there, if you've ever spent any time at all in the mountains, you are familiar with this guy, the Steller's jay. So they live anywhere from about 3,000 to 10,000 feet in elevation. They have just a ridiculous looking mohawk. They're such cool birds, and they're very bold. They're very talkative. So that's why I say, even if you have spent, one day in the mountains ever in your life here in Colorado, you've probably seen or heard the Steller's jay. Something that's kind of interesting is they can actually interbreed with blue jays. So their ranges don't overlap very much at all, but where they do overlap, they can interbreed, and when we get a blue jay, Steller's jay hybrid. I was in the mountains, well, gosh, a while ago now, because we haven't been able to go to the mountains for a while, but I had actually never noticed, if you look at this picture, and look at the forehead, there are two vertical white stripes on its forehead. And then it actually does have a bit of a white eyebrow as well. And I had never really noticed those before, even though I'd seen them 1,000 times. And so this is always a good reminder. And the same goes with the blue jay too. These birds that we see so often, we might just, or something like a robin, we might just say, oh, it's a robin, oh, it's a blue jay, whatever. And you might start to pay less and less attention to them. But then that kind of robs us of these beautiful details that these birds have, or even just how the Steller's jay goes, this kind of gradient, the dark black head to the gray mid body and to that beautiful blue in its wings and tail. So that, I think, is a really good reminder of even these common birds that we think we know a lot about. I challenge you, the next time you see a blue jay or a robin or a Steller's jay, to really study it and see if you can notice anything you might have not noticed before. The next one on the bottom here is our Canada jay. And just like with our Woodhouse's scrub jay, you might be saying, wait a minute, I thought that was a gray jay. Well, in 2018, they changed it from gray jay to Canada jay. Their nickname also is a camp robber. So most birds in the Corvid family are quite bold. They're very social. They're not too afraid to come up and try to steal your trail mix or your granola bar from you. So that's where these guys get that nickname of camp robbers. They'll just fly into your camp and see what they can see. So these jays, the Canada jay, they are really high up there in the mountains. So they're boreal and subalpine forest. And something that's really interesting about these birds is they will actually breed quite early in the year. So maybe even in January and February, which when you first think about it, might not make a lot of sense. It's quite cold up in the mountains in January and February. Why would they choose to raise their chicks then? Well, they, like I mentioned earlier, and we'll keep talking about, they cache their food. So they're able to store enough food in hiding places all throughout the forest that they're actually able to have their chicks and raise successful nests just by the food that they have stored, which is quite amazing. And the way that they cache this food, a lot of corvids and a lot of birds will bury it, but Canada jays actually, they have a special gland that will produce like a glue, so they can glue their food to their hiding spots, maybe like under bark or under some lichen or something like that. So those are our jays. Next we have our magpies, which again, if you are in the Front Range of Colorado, you are probably familiar with these birds. I can remember the first time I saw a magpie. I'm not from Colorado, so the first time I was visiting here, I just remember seeing so many of them and being absolutely in awe because they're big, they're beautiful. That long tail is just incredible. So they're quite eye-catching. They really prefer open grasslands and shrublands. They really like to be visible. So a lot of birds you might be familiar, the males will sing, right, to assert their territory. But what magpies will do is actually sit on top of fence posts and trees so that everyone around them can see that this is their territory. And they, of course, are very, very social birds as well. And I love this picture on the bottom with its wings outstretched. You can just see that really interesting patterning and how iridescent their wings are. And then their tail, they kind of have this V-shaped tail. And then of course, when they're sitting, it's just so long and beautiful. And there is actually a yellow-billed magpie as well, but that only lives in like Central California. I think it looks exactly the same, but it has this bright yellow bill. So this is our black-billed magpie. Okay, so next we have our Clark's nutcracker. This is Stacy's favorite bird today. They live pretty high up in elevation as well, so where those Canada jays are living. And similar, they are early nesters as well. So that's an adaptation that both the Canada jay and this nutcracker has, is that they nest early, way earlier than most birds do. And they're able to do that because of this caching behavior that they have. And if you take a look at that bill is perfectly evolved to pry open pine seeds and to get out those really nutrient dense pine seeds that are inside. And they have a really, really cool relationship with the pine forest, and we're gonna dig into that in just a few slides here. Okay, so next is our American crow, and there are a couple of other crow species in the United States, but we're going to focus on the American crow. That's definitely the most common and the most widespread. So they are really, really adaptable birds, which of course is made obvious by even if you are downtown, if you're in downtown Denver or somewhere, you can see a crow or several crows fairly easily. So they're very well adapted to living among people. They tend to live in family groups. So this will consist of the breeding pair and offspring from the past, maybe up to 5 years even. And those offspring will help to raise the newer offspring. So they work really cooperatively, which is really, really cool. That doesn't happen a whole lot in the bird world, but crows are one of the birds that will live in family groups. And then during the winter, even though they might not migrate, they will form these communal roosts, which can consist of up to 2 million crows, which is really incredible. So that's our crow that you've almost definitely seen. And then the last bird that we're going to talk about for identification today is the common raven. So the raven, just like the crow, they are adapted to a really, really wide variety of habitats as well. However, they really prefer to stay on the edges of cities or in forests. Crows really like more open land, so you probably won't see them in forests. Up high you could, but definitely more likely to see a raven if you're up in the mountains. And they're cliff nesters as well, whereas crows nest in trees. Another difference is that ravens usually form pairs. So the breeding pair, they'll stay together throughout the year, and they'll congregate, like, if there is a carcass or if they're at a landfill or something like that, crows will gather together, but for the most part, they're staying and traveling in pairs. Ravens are incredibly intelligent, and that will be kind of the second half of this webinar, is talking about the intelligence of the Corvid family. But one thing they will do is they will work together to hunt or steal food. So they might, try to distract. It's common for them to prey on other birds, so they might distract the parent bird to get them off the nest, and the other one will come in and steal the eggs. Or they've been known to follow other water birds like mergansers or something like that that are chasing fish. They will go in and then just steal those fish from the mergansers that work so hard to catch them. So they're pretty tricky like that. And then just like all corvids, I think especially crows, ravens, and magpies, they hold a lot of symbolism. There's a lot of folklore around them, from the ravens in the Tower of London to Native American stories and things like that. We simply don't have enough time to go into those, but there are a lot of resources if you're interested in more folklore about the Corvid family. And of course, this wouldn't be complete without figuring out what is the difference between crows and ravens. How do we figure out if what we're looking at is a crow or a raven? So enter in the chat box, which one do you think? So the top one and the bottom one, which one is a crow? Which one is a raven? And why?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, the top one's a crow,
Uh-huh.
and the bottom one's a raven.
Nice job. And what makes you think that?
Oh.
Why is the top one a crow?
Because it's an allergy.
Because it's not a raven? Absolutely.
Why is the
Yeah.
bottom one a raven?
Because it's bigger.
It's bigger?
Because it has.
Say it's bigger.
It's bigger.
It's bigger. That's right. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's see. Yes, you are absolutely correct. The top one is an American crow, and the bottom one is a common raven. So let's break this down a little bit. So crows, they are smaller. They usually are in groups, like we talked about, living in family groups. When they're flying, their wings kind of look like they're swimming. So they're doing this constant swimming motion, and they almost never glide. Another thing is they have a rounded tail, and the sound they make, you've definitely heard it before, that caw, caw is how crows sound. So now ravens are larger, like our friend mentioned. They're in pairs, so that the breeding pairs just stay together usually. If you notice on this picture, the bottom picture, they tend to have these shaggy, shiny throat feathers that the crows lack. And when they're flying, they use these really like light, graceful wing beats, and they will soar occasionally. So if you are looking up at a bird, a big black bird that's flying, what you want to try to notice is how its wing beats are moving, and then its tail. So that's another really, really great one. And I'll have another picture in the next slide where we can compare the tail. Ravens have a wedge or kind of a triangle shaped tail. So that's another really, really good field mark. And then their call is more like gravelly and almost more of a croak. Keep in mind though that corvids are really good at mimicking, and they just have a whole range of vocalizations that they can make. But in general, ravens are going to have a much more kind of croaky call, if you will. So here's our next slide. So go ahead and type in the chat box. So I have them numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. Type in the chat box, who is who, what is what? American crow, common raven. What do you think? And Stacy, if you could let me know if we have folks answering. I can't see the chat box.
Someone thinks a raven is numbers 3 and 4. 1 is American crow. We have lots of number 1s as crows.
Mm-hmm.
Crow, raven, crow, raven. Number 2, raven. We have lots of great guesses coming in from everyone.
Nice. Yeah, we all are paying attention. Excellent work. Here's our answer key. So yes, number 1 is an American crow. So you can see it doesn't have those kind of shaggy feathers. And then number 3 is a raven. You can see it here. They're just like really glossy, kind of shaggy looking. And then the bills too, if you look at their beaks, the crow, both of their beaks are quite hefty, right? But the raven, its beak is almost comically large compared to its head, right? And then on the right-hand side, this is where we can see the difference in flight. So this top one, number 3, is the common raven, and you can see how its tail is more pointed, more like a wedge at the end. And then on the bottom, number 4 is the American crow. So its tail is just curved on the end. And again, just to get another look, on the left side, we have our raven with its big chunky bill, tiny little head, and its pointed wedge tail. And then on the right, our American crow with its slimmer beak and its more rounded tail. And a trick that I use to remember which is which with the tail shaped. So I remember raven has a V in it. So it has a V-shaped tail. And then crow starts with C. So, and its tail is rounded like the letter C. So that's how I try to remember. All right, so that is kind of going to be the end of our identification section of the webinar. Stacy, do we have any questions so far?
Not at the moment, but feel free, everyone, to type them in the chat box and we will happily do our best to answer them.
Yes, absolutely. All right, moving right along then, we're going to dig in to what I find incredibly interesting about corvids, and I think you will too, and probably why you were excited to join us on this webinar. So this book here is, I'm rereading it. It's one of my favorite books. It's so interesting. I highly recommend it, called The Genius of Birds. So usually if we call or get called a bird brain, it is not a compliment, right? We take that to mean that someone is slow or not very smart, things like that. But what the science is telling us is that this is simply not true. Birds are really pretty smart creatures, which might not surprise you if you think about it overall, and we'll kind of get more into this. But I want to quickly read a section from the beginning of this book that talks about intelligence. And the thing with intelligence is that it's really hard to define, and even in humans, and scientists don't agree on just one definition. So this says, intelligence is a slippery concept. Even in our own species, it's tricky to define and tricky to measure. One psychologist describes it as the capacity to learn or to profit by experience. Another as the capacity to acquire capacity. In the same sort of circular definition offered up by Harvard psychologist Edwin Boring, intelligence is what is measured by intelligence tests. As Robert Sternberg, a former dean at Tufts University, once quipped, there seem to be almost as many definitions of intelligence as experts to define it. In judging the overall intelligence of animals, scientists may look at how successful they are at surviving and reproducing in many different environments. By this measure, birds trump nearly all vertebrates, including fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. They are the one form of wildlife visible nearly everywhere. They live in every part of the globe, from the equator to the poles, from the lowest desert to the highest peaks, and virtually every habitat on land, sea, and in bodies of fresh water. In biological terms, they have a very big ecological niche. As a class, birds have been around for more than 100 million years. They are one of nature's greatest success stories, inventing new strategies for survival, their own distinctive brands of ingenuity that, in some respects at least, seem to far outpace our own. So what a lot of this research, and certainly not just on birds, on the more classic animals that we think of when we talk about intelligence, like chimpanzees and orangutans, dolphins, dogs, these kinds of animals, it just always has been funny to me how we think that humans are kind of at the top of the intelligence ladder, but it really is how you look at it. It's on perspective and how you define intelligence. So we're going to go through a couple of examples of just what makes corvids what you might call intelligent. And then a quick note on brains. So going back to this kind of bird-brained terminology. So the old thought was that, well, gosh, birds are pretty small, so that means their brains are really small, so there's just not a lot of room for them to be smart, right? So they have small brains, that means they're not smart. Well, it turns out that while, yes, their brains are small, their brains are actually pretty big compared to their body size, just like ours, just like in primates. And what they figured out is truly, it's not so much the size of your brain that matters, it's the concentration of neurons. So those nerve cells in our brains that are sending signals. And birds actually seem to have a lot of neurons. So even though they're small, there's a lot packed in there. Another thing was that in primates, we have a cerebral cortex in our brain. And the old school thought was that this cerebral cortex was absolutely required for advanced cognition. Without it, you simply couldn't do the things that primates could do. But corvids and birds don't have this. They have a completely different brain structure, but it operates in a similar way. So this is an example of what we call convergent evolution. So that is when, two completely separate creatures evolve a similar adaptation or structure, thing like that, that accomplishes the same task. So like, for example, wings. Both birds and bats have wings. Their common ancestor is way, way, way long time ago. But they both have evolved wings to help them to survive. So there's just a lot of really, really incredible research being done. And as science advances, even with brain imaging and learning what is going on, what areas of the brain are lighting up during these experiments. Okay, so one of the things that you're probably most familiar with is mimicry. And keep in mind, as we go through all of these behaviors, you can pretty much assume that all corvids do it in some fashion. So some might be more adept at it than others, but all corvids will do a lot of these behaviors. So the blue jay, masters of mimicry for sure. So I was, and a lot of you might have experienced this too, I was sitting out in my yard one day and I heard a red-tailed hawk, which is not uncommon for where I live. So I looked up and I tried to find it. I didn't see it, and I heard it call again. I looked up, tried to find it, I could not find it. But what I did notice was this cheeky blue jay sitting in my tree, sure enough, mimicking the call of a red-tailed hawk. And I had heard of this happening, but I had never actually experienced it for myself. And it was so funny to hear that noise coming out of a blue jay. So there's a few theories about why birds do this. We're not 100% sure. So one reason could be that they are warning other birds or other, specifically, their species, that a hawk or a predator is nearby. Another thing, and what I think this particular blue jay was doing, is to scare other birds away. So my neighbors have bird feeders, and I think what this blue jay was doing was trying to scare the birds away from the feeders so that it could go in and just pig out all by itself. But they've also been observed mimicking when there's no one around. So they could be doing it just for fun, just like when we sing in the shower just for fun. It could be that too. We don't know for sure. And then a little bit about how birds vocalize and how they're able to mimic, and even if they're not mimids, just making all these incredibly complex vocalizations. So in our throat, we have our voice box, or the larynx. Birds have a different structure called the syrinx. And so in this bigger picture, you can see two pipes. So where we have one, birds have two. And these little levers here that look like they're closing the pipes, those act almost like pinball machine levers. They can go back and forth, and birds have a really complex set of muscles that can control those levers independently. So that allows them to make two different sounds at one time, which is really, really, really cool. There's some really neat visualizations, like if you look it up on YouTube, and it will show you, I think it's on Cornell actually, on All About Birds, what it looks like as these two levers are moving and the different sounds that come out. I think they have it for a northern cardinal and a house wren maybe. It's really, really cool. So another really interesting behavior, and I've mentioned this quite a few times already, is caching food. So just like you might see a squirrel running around collecting food and hiding it for winter, a lot of corvids do this exact same thing. And probably the master of this is this Clark's nutcracker. So you can see, and we mentioned this earlier, you can see that long bill, which is perfectly adapted to prying open these pine cones and getting the seeds out. And you might notice in this picture, its throat looks a little bit bulgy. And that's because they have a pouch called a subgular pouch. And they can hold up to 100 seeds in there at one time. So these nutcrackers are flitting around the pine trees, gathering as many seeds as they can, storing them in that pouch, and then they'll fly and figure out where their caches, where their hiding spots are going to be. And generally those are going to be in the ground. So they'll dig a little hole, put 4 or 5 seeds, go somewhere else, put 4 or 5 more seeds, and they can go up to 20 miles away to find their different cache spots. They can have up to 20,000, and they can remember them all, or just about all of them anyway, pretty close. So 2 things. They have a symbiotic relationship with many types of pine trees. And so what that means is that both the pine trees and the nutcrackers benefit from this relationship. So of course the bird is getting food, and like we mentioned earlier, it's able to even raise chicks during the dead of winter because it stores these really nutrient-rich seeds. But then for the pine trees, that bird is not going to remember all of its caches, but then those seeds are going to sprout into new trees. So these birds are responsible for a lot of forest regeneration. And especially as we're seeing more and more diseases in trees, like with the pine beetle and things like that, scientists and biologists are looking to see if we can actually use the Clark's nutcracker as a conservation tool. So what they maybe could be able to do is set out some seeds, maybe buckets of seeds that are resistant to pine beetle, and then the nutcrackers will come in and gather those seeds and start distributing and dispersing those throughout the forest, and helping to grow resistant trees. It's not a thing yet, but I think, or at least not that I know of, but I did read about it, and that would be so cool because these birds could plant so many more trees than biologists out there trying to hand plant saplings. So how do they remember what is going on in this bird's head? I can't even remember where I put my keys. How does this bird remember 20,000 different spots that it has put seeds? Well, they have an incredible spatial memory, and not a lot of birds, but these birds, chickadees as well, they're actually able to grow their brains in their hippocampus. So that's your area, the area of your brain. We have one too. That's your spatial memory and recognition. And so they're actually able to grow that part of their brain during the fall and winter when they need to remember where all of these things are hidden. And so they have that really, really great spatial memory. And then there's been studies done of how they find them. And what they found is that they can triangulate. So maybe they hide a cache and they notice there's a boulder to the right and a tree straight in front and a smaller boulder to the left. And they can remember that and triangulate and find these seeds as they come back to them. Okay, next are crows. So crows, particularly the species called the New Caledonian crow, have been found to be really, really adept at using tools. So again, the old school of thought was that really it's only humans and chimpanzees and orangutans that are able to make and use tools. But that's just simply not true. They have seen it both in laboratory settings and in the wild that crows can make and use tools. And I want to point out too that it's one thing, and I mean it's still an amazing thing for an animal to be able to use a tool. But it's a whole nother level of cognition and intelligence for an animal to make a tool. So instead of, for example, instead of just using, finding a twig to stick into a hole and try to scrape some insects out, that certainly is incredible. But what these particular New Caledonian crows can do is actually find certain twigs and fashion them into hooks. So you can see the top one here, they had given this crow several pieces of wire that were all straight, and in front of her is this tube, and in the bottom of the tube there is a little bucket with a handle that has food. And so this crow took a piece of wire, fashioned a hook, stuck it down in there, and was able to grab the handle of the bucket and pull it out to get her treat. These crows also take leaves of a certain plant and can make them they'll rip different pieces off and make it almost like a saw so that they can, and that helps them to get insects more efficiently out of these logs. It's just incredible what they can do. So making tools. Another thing that you might have heard of, I hadn't until recently, but are these things called crow funerals. And I believe magpies do it as well. So what this is you might see a crow that has died, and there's other crows that are swarming it or around it, or they might be sitting in the trees and just making a lot of racket. And so scientists aren't sure exactly why this is happening. Are they mourning the loss, like elephants do, of one of their flock? Are they trying to learn what happened to that crow so that they don't come to the same fate? They're just not really sure what's going on. But it's a thing that happens. It's not a fluke that we see. And there's a really great episode of this podcast I love called Ologies. And I'll link this in the email we send. But there's a whole episode on crow funerals and this researcher that has done quite a few studies on it to see what in the heck is going on. All right, and last we have our ravens. Whoops, here we go. So in ravens, scientists have found, or think they have found, ravens might possess what we call theory of mind. And basically what that means is that they can infer what someone or something else might be thinking. So let me think. So for example, there was a study where they had these ravens in an aviary, and they had a tarp separating the middle. And on one side of the tarp were the ravens, and there was a treat. And on the other side of the tarp, there were the researchers, and there was a hole in the middle of the tarp that the researchers could look through. And so the ravens, if they saw that the researchers were looking through the hole, they could infer that, oh gee, I better hide this treat really, really well, or even re-hide it later, because that person is seeing what I'm doing and I don't want them to steal it. Whereas if the researchers were not in the room on the other side of that tarp, the ravens seemed to know that nobody was watching them, so they would hide it, but not hide it particularly well. Another thing is with bartering. So they have learned to collect blue bottle caps to trade in for treats. So they would be conditioned to, if they give the researcher one blue bottle cap, they get one piece of dog kibble. But if they have 3 bottle caps, they get 3 pieces of dog kibble. So they kind of learned how to use these bottle caps as currency. And this is something, and to kind of wait for something better. And this is something that was studied in humans back in the 60s, and it's something called the marshmallow test. And so they took children and they told them, okay, you can have this one marshmallow now, or if you can wait for me to come back in the room, then I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And so and they recorded it. So the researcher would set a marshmallow in front of the child and say, okay, I'll be back later. And then of course they were filming, and they would be able to see if the child ate the marshmallow and just could not wait, or if the child was able to wait for them to come back and then get 2 marshmallows. And so that has a lot to do with our executive functioning. And it takes until a human child, is about 4 years old to be able to really resist that marshmallow sitting in front of them, and to be able to understand that if I just wait and hold back, I can have even more. And so ravens have been shown to do that as well. And then of course memory, there are a lot of studies saying that ravens and other corvids remember faces. So if you do a raven or a crow wrong, they can remember your face for up to a month, which is pretty incredible. Okay. Whew, that was a lot. So that is kind of about the intelligence of corvids, and we're just about done with slides here. So before we do our last quiz here, I want to check in again to see if we have any questions.
Yeah, we had a couple. One of them is, do we know why crows travel together in groups?
Great question. So some animals are social, like humans. Elephants are social. And in the bird world, some birds are social and stay together in groups, and some are not. Some travel by themselves. And there are pros and cons to both. So if you are a social bird, some pros to that might be that there's more protection, right? There's protection in numbers. You probably have more food security. You can all help each other find food and hunt. A downside might be that you are more recognizable, right? So if you are a group of crows, you're pretty recognizable, right? And they're quite loud. So if you are a small little songbird that is lower on the food chain, you probably want to be by yourself because it's easier to hide. So crows are nice big birds, and they're pretty good at protecting themselves. So it is more beneficial for them to be social, I suppose.
Awesome. And then going back to mimicking for just a quick second, do they teach their young to mimic, or how do they learn? Do we know that?
Good question. So all birds, they are born with this innate ability to start singing, but just like us, when we are young or even when we're not young and we're trying to learn a song or remember all of the words to a song, it takes practice. And so they do listen to the adults that are around them in their area. And so it's kind of both. They listen to the adults and try to mimic and do what they do, but it's also just a little bit innate as well.
Great. And we just had another question come in. How do birds recognize their mates?
Good question. So I think in lots of different ways, right? So there are subtleties in every individual bird that might be invisible to the human eye. So for example, a lot of birds, maybe all birds, can see in the ultraviolet spectrum, which we can't see. So there might be other markings and things on birds that are only visible in that spectrum that we can't see, but that other birds can see. And just like we were talking about at the very beginning with the blue jay and that the black bridle that they have around their head, even though they all might look pretty much the same to us, to individual blue jays, they might look quite different. So just like, we can tell our friends apart, a bird might think, oh gosh, all humans look the same. How do they even know who their own children or who their mate is? The opposite or the same is true for birds. They just can tell there's these different variations in birds.
Great. We don't have any more questions in at the moment.
Awesome. Okay, so this is going to be kind of our final quiz. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Go ahead and type in the chat box which corvids you think those are. And if you have a field guide handy, that's not cheating, that's using your resources. So feel free to use a field guide. Do we have any answers coming in yet, Stace?
Not yet. I think everyone is thinking really hard using
Nice.
those field guides.
Keep it up.
All right, we think blue jay, Clark's nutcracker, Canadian jay, stellar jay, raven, and crow.
Okay, here we go. Here's the big reveal. How did you do?
Magpie. Here come all the great answers. There we go.
Good, good.
Good job, everyone.
All right, here are the answers. Number 1 is a blue jay. Number 2 is the Clark's nutcracker. So you can see it could be easy to confuse the Clark's nutcracker and the Canada jay. They're both gray, black, and white birds. The Canada jay, I think, looks more kind of like a chickadee almost, right? With that patterning and kind of rounded head and rounded body. And then remember the nutcracker, just like its name suggests, has that long tweezer-like beak to help it pry open pine cones, and it has that white eye ring as well. Then number 4 is our Stellar's jay with its intense black mohawk and white stripes and fading down to blue on the rest of its body. And then the last 2 were tricks. They were both common ravens. So in the first one, in number 5, you can see up close those shiny, shaggy throat feathers, this huge, huge bill, tiny little head. And then in the last picture, number 6, just kind of a zoomed out version, so you can still see it's quite iridescent, really, really big bill, long tail. All right, nice job, everybody. Very well done. So we are just about out of time here, and I just want to give a heartfelt thanks for all of you being here with us today. We really, really appreciate it. We, of course, miss seeing people in person more than anything. Spring would generally be one of our busiest seasons. So as you can imagine, we're quite sad about not being able to see all of our students coming out to field trips and things like that. And also that means, unfortunately, that our revenue is down quite a bit. So if you are able, and if you want to see more programming like this and want to help us just be able to get back in the game and hit the ground running once it's safe for us to do so, if you are able to make a donation, you can go to our website, birdconservancy.org, and just know that the education team appreciates it from the bottom of our hearts. So thank you again. We have more events coming up, more webinars, lots of fun stuff. And the best way to keep track of that is through our Facebook page or visiting our website. You can also reach us via email at education@birdconservancy.org. So we can stay on for a few more minutes. If anyone else has questions or wants me to go back to a slide or anything like that, I'm more than happy to do so. And then in the next, early next week, I will send out an email that will have the link to the YouTube recording and the PDF of all of these slides that I used today and any other relevant resources that we might have talked about. So thank you all so much, and just let me know if you have any questions.
So we did just have a question come in. Do you think it's okay to feed corvids like other birds? For example, is it okay to give them peanuts?
Yeah, it is. So like blue jays especially, well, they all really, really love peanuts, but if you want to attract blue jays to your yard, you can certainly put peanuts out. Just make sure that they're not roasted and not salted. There's no oils or anything, just plain raw peanuts. So it's definitely okay to do so, but you kind of want to be careful what you wish for too if you're wanting to attract those. So you know, things like especially crows and jays, these bigger, or crows and ravens, these bigger birds, if they are coming to your yard, remember, they're quite smart, so they might be able to break into your trash can. And so if they start wreaking havoc like that, that can be frustrating, but then can also start attracting rodents, right? If they are constantly spilling your trash cans or things like that. So I would say it's definitely okay to put out bird seed and peanuts and things like that. But crows and ravens like dog food. I wouldn't put out dog food or anything because that could definitely attract rodents to your yard. We don't want to do that.
I think that's all the questions we have for now.
Excellent. All right, well, we will go ahead and end it then. Again, thank you all so very much. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you on another webinar and in person even sometime soon. Take care, everyone.